But how do we know that the Gospels are written by the names on the label and why the Christians are not addressing this accordingly?
So we don't know, but we strongly suspect because the first time those names appear are around 180 AD, whereas the early church fathers were quoting from these gospels for a good 80 years before that. And they would, when they were quoting from things like the letters, they would say, this is from the letter to Galatians. They would specifically use the names of the authors of the letters they're quoting. But when they were quoting the gospels, they're completely silent
Mm.
on which book they're quoting up until about 180 AD, when it sure looks like what happened there was, that someone just needed to start a tradition. The other part of it is that our earliest reports from Papias for both Matthew and Mark, when he talks about Matthew, he says that the book was written in Hebrew and that it was a list of sayings.
Hmm.
Now, Matthew was Greek, clearly written in Greek,
Yeah.
and was not a list of sayings. So whatever Papias was describing wasn't what we call Matthew. And the same thing with Mark. His one thing says about Mark that it was derived from the testimony of Peter and that absolutely nothing was left out. Where suddenly we have Mark being completely the shortest. We talked about this already. It's the
Yeah.
shortest, most briefest book. It sure doesn't seem like the one where nothing is left out. So again, we just don't know. There may have been a Gospel of Mark and a Gospel of Matthew that were circulating at the time, but not the books that we're using under those names, right?
Right. And
So it just seems sus,
Yeah, oh yeah, and it makes you wonder if they're talking about Q, but then he says
Mm,
it's Hebrew. And
right?
I don't know if Q is supposed to be in Hebrew.
And you'd think Q would be in Aramaic since that's what Jesus spoke,
True.
right?
well, you would think. But, God preserved his word pretty well here, it seems. Just teasing. Gray's 174. The post death visions back then tended not to lead people to believe in bodily resurrection. Objection is non trivial for me to work out. Thoughts?
The idea here is that, again, it goes back to the video I made about Sean, and I hear it all the time. Well, it can't have been a hallucination because no one changes their beliefs because of a hallucination. And that's like, again, I think that's also trivial. It's like, of course we do. Of course people do. People suffer hallucinations and change what they believe all the time. It doesn't, and how would you test that? How would you know, right? That
Right.
someone's decision making was not based on that. So again, I just I agree with the person writing. It was
Yeah,
Grays
Gray's.
that that's a stupid objection because there's no way you could tell, right?
If
Yeah,
I might add to this just briefly to make a point, I don't think Paul has a bodily resurrection in mind. So to attribute his vision of Christ with bodily resurrection, I don't see it. I mean, that doesn't mean he didn't think he had some form of a body. So when you say bodily, I'm defining that as physical and it could be something else. But just to make the point though, on this whole thing, I think that Luke and John want you to think it's physical because they're probably arguing against people we call docetics. We also see this in like First John, like 1 John, where it's like, oh, we saw him, we touched him, and we saw, behold his glory. We know he's like physical. They want you to know that because there were Christians that were starting in the second century to say, hey, Jesus was so divine. We can't imagine him with Middle Platonism in mind. We can't imagine our Lord having that icky stuff we call flesh. That's why First John says, he who says he hasn't come in the flesh is like an antichrist. So here you have John and Luke saying stuff like he has a body, a physical touch me body, because they want to combat what appears to be docetism or something like it. Anyway, there's my two cents. I don't know if I took your question and went somewhere else. I don't know if Paul was hitting the
Actually,
nail
no, I
on the
think
head.
you answered it better than I did. You up
well,
there answered
I
better than I did. So
what I'm about to say might take it. Is my mic on? Oh, it's on, okay. This might be a little
Can you
bit
guys
off,
hear Neil? I'm just kidding. Neil, go ahead.
might be a little bit off what the person's asking for, but I think it's related. What I don't think makes sense about the bodily resurrection is that when you get people who die, for example, you get the rich man and Lazarus parable, and he's in a place, he's in hell or whatever, and there's the bosom of Abraham is above him, and he's begging for a drop of water. He's somewhere and he's conscious, but he's not in his body. His body didn't get resurrected, right? His body's dead in a grave somewhere on earth. And like, so when you die, do you actually go to hell right away, or are you gone and you're not conscious and you're waiting? Paul talks about in one of his epistles think it's Corinthians, where he says it's going to be in the flash of an instant. We're just going to be raised up into the clouds, and heaven on earth's going to. It's just kind of like it's a flash instant. Like you're dead, you don't know you're dead, and you're not conscious. Then you're raised up in the bodily.
What's your reference on that?
On which verse that is?
Yeah.
I think that's First Corinthians 15.
Yeah, because that's at the end resurrection. So I mean, Paul, not well. Let's turn this into pugilism combat now.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, because doesn't that defeat the purpose of dying and going to heaven or hell? Because aren't you waiting for?
Well, so this is a huge schism between, of course, Catholicism and Protestantism. And at me I was a Protestant. I'm a Protestant atheist. So the there's the verse, and I can't remember the reference, but to be out of the body is to be with the Lord, right? Essentially for believers. And we always pointed to that to say that essentially we don't know if people are in heaven, but as soon as they die, you're with the Lord in some sense. But we're all waiting for new heaven to be on this earth, right? Like God is replacing this earth with new heaven. And we know that time doesn't necessarily make sense outside of it, but that don't worry, the people aren't in hell and they're not in purgatory. They are with the Lord in some sense, but we're all waiting for our heavenly bodies to happen all at once on that day. Like in 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about how those who are dead get their bodies first, and then those who are still alive get their bodies next.
It's a transformation.
Right.
So it's really weird, the language Paul uses. But one thing you brought up about Lazarus, just to bring up, that you showed earlier, is there is a Greek myth where, who was it that begs Asclepius?
Oh, Artemis. Our Hippolytus gets killed. He gets mangled by a what do you call it? A chariot. He's in a chariot, and he falls off the chariot. He gets mangled. His body's all bloody and mangled. He's dead. Artemis is in love with him. Asclepius is nearby, and she begs him to revive him, and he brings him back to life.
Resuscitation, though, like Lazarus, not transformation.
Resurrects him.
Right.
He was dead. And then Zeus was pissed about it, because
we know that's real. We know that really happened, though. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
I don't want you guys to don't conflate the two Lazaruses, because there's two Lazaruses. Is that where you're going, Derek?
No. I was just simply trying to say that Lazarus's resurrection was a resuscitation, and we find those also in Greek myths right there, contemporaneous to the Gospels. So
I see what you're saying, but to go back to what I was getting at, it almost doesn't seem like, what's the point of having a bodily resurrection when we can be in with heaven, when we can be in another avatar somewhere else, in another realm? It just doesn't. It's just weird. I get what you're saying, Paulogia answered that perfectly. Like that made sense. But
I'm quoting the
no
apology.
Biblical perspective.
It's the internal critique.
If you were a pastor, I would have been like, oh, good answer.
Yeah,
it made sense. But it also still is like, what's the point, though? You know what I mean?
Are we talking about
Go ahead.
Are we talking about the apologetic, where they say that no one in the ancient world believed in bodily resurrection or immortalization, which is what makes Christ's resurrection utterly unique?
Yeah.
We weren't, but you can. And although isn't the apologetic that it's specifically the Jews didn't?
And they make it seem like they're almost atheists, but they're not. They just don't have
No, they say that they absolutely make a blanket statement that it's nowhere to be found in the ancient world, and it's utterly false. I mean, I can tell you just a few examples here. The gravitas, the weight of Heracles, is felt when he arrives upon Mount Olympus, where he also marries and procreates. Asclepius appears in full bodily presence, not as a mere phantom per Celsus. Romulus appears to Proculus Julius more than human and finely dressed in shining armor. This apologetic that you hear from Christian scholars so often, that you don't find bodily immortalization or resurrection in the ancient world anywhere other than the resurrection of Jesus, is false. It's not true.
This might be a sign of the evolving apologetic, because I've certainly heard, just like, you used to hear people say that the apostles all died for their beliefs. Now they're saying they're willing to die. That's an evolution of the apologetic. Maybe, Derek, what you're referring to, because I've been in the last 4 or 5 years, at least, I've heard them specifically say, well, Hebrews didn't believe in bodily resurrection as opposed to the ancient world. And it's probably in response to what you just said.
Probably. And I think Egypt there's some examples of bodily resurrection happening with Osiris, or maybe not Osiris, but I'm not sure. I'm just throwing it out there.
Oh, absolutely, with Osiris.
But
it's absolutely bodily.
But to your point, Paulogia, that they talk about the Sadducees being, they're
Right.
Torah Orthodox Sadducees who don't believe in a bodily resurrection, and there's nothing special happening. Jesus gives us the bodily resurrection. It's better, like whatever.
And everyone on the panel can just call me Paul because that's weird. So.
All right.
Dr. Paul?